The bullet grazed so close to Sarah McKenna's cheek that she felt the heat of it before the sound of the gunshot even registered, and, in that split second between life and death, she wondered if anyone would ever find the sourdough starter she'd been nursing for 3 years hidden in the root cellar. She hit the wooden planks of the general store porch hard, splinters catching in her calico dress as chaos erupted around her. 2 men were shooting at each other in the middle of Tombstone's main street, their horses rearing and stamping, kicking up clouds of Arizona dust that turned the afternoon sun into a hazy orange blur. Sarah pressed herself flat against the rough boards, her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear the shouting and the thunder of hooves. Then suddenly there were boots beside her head, worn leather boots with silver spurs that jingled even in all the commotion. A hand grabbed her arm, strong and sure, and hauled her up like she weighed nothing at all. Sarah found herself pressed against a solid chest, being half carried, half dragged into the narrow alley between the general store and the assayer's office. The man who held her moved with purpose, his body curved protectively around hers as another shot rang out. They stumbled together into the shadows, and he finally released her, stepping back to look her over with eyes the color of whiskey and firelight. "You hit?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much, or maybe like he'd spent too many nights breathing campfire smoke. Sarah shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. She was trembling now, the delayed shock hitting her all at once. "I don't think so. I was just buying flour." The cowboy nodded once, satisfied she was intact, and moved to the mouth of the alley to peer out at the street. He was tall and lean, built like a man who spent his life in the saddle. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, too long and unkempt, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. His clothes were dusty and worn, his gun belt sitting low on his hips, and there was something about the way he held himself, wary and watchful, that told Sarah he was used to trouble. Out on the street, the shooting had stopped. Men's voices called back and forth, and Sarah heard the marshal's distinctive bark ordering someone to drop their weapon. The cowboy stayed where he was, watching, until the tension seemed to drain from his shoulders. He holstered the gun Sarah hadn't even noticed he'd drawn. "Seems like it's over," he said, still not looking at her. "You should probably get on home before something else starts up." Sarah smoothed down her dress with shaking hands, trying to regain some composure. She was 23 years old and had lived in Tombstone for 2 years now, ever since she'd come west after her parents died of fever back in Missouri. She'd seen bar fights and heard gunshots in the night, but she'd never been quite that close to a bullet before. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "You probably saved my life." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and something flickered in those amber eyes before he shuttered it away. "Just happened to be there," he said with a shrug. "Any man would have done the same." "Maybe," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure that was true. "But you're the one who did." He didn't seem to know what to do with that, so he just touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost courtly, despite his rough appearance. "Ma'am," he said, and turned to go. "Wait," Sarah called out before she could stop herself. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. She didn't know what had possessed her, but the words tumbled out anyway. "Have you eaten? Today, I mean?" His brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" I was making a roast this morning before I came into town, with potatoes and carrots from my garden, and biscuits. There's far too much for just me, and it seems like the least I could do to thank you." She was babbling now, nervous under his stare, but she kept going. "I have a little house just at the edge of town, the one with the blue shutters near the creek. If you're hungry, I mean." For a long moment he just looked at her, and Sarah was sure he was going to refuse. Men like him, drifters and loners, they didn't accept charity from strange women. But then his eyes dropped briefly to her flour sack, still clutched in her arms, and something in his expression shifted. Softened, maybe. Just a fraction. "I could eat," he said quietly. That was how Sarah McKenna found herself walking down the dusty street of Tombstone with a cowboy whose name she didn't even know yet, leading him toward the little house she'd worked so hard to make into a home. People watched them pass, curious and some disapproving, but Sarah kept her chin up. She'd learned in her 2 years alone that people would talk no matter what you did, so you might as well do what felt right. The house really did have blue shutters, faded now by the harsh Arizona sun, but still cheerful against the weathered wood. Sarah had bought the place with money from selling her mother's jewelry, and though it was small, just 3 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, it was hers. She had a garden out back that she'd coaxed into reluctant life with precious water from the creek and chickens in a coop that actually produced eggs most days. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd ever thought she'd have after her parents died and left her with nothing but debts. She pushed open the door and gestured for the cowboy to enter. He hesitated on the threshold, suddenly seeming uncertain, and Sarah realized he was probably taking in how clean and neat everything was. She kept the place spotless, with curtains she'd sewn herself and a rag rug she'd braided from scraps. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table, and the smell of the roast she'd left in the oven filled the small space with warmth. "I should probably wash up," he said, looking down at his dust-covered clothes. "There's a pump out back," Sarah told him, "and soap hanging beside it. Take your time." He nodded and disappeared around the side of the house, and Sarah let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. What was she doing? Inviting a strange man into her home? But he didn't feel strange somehow. He felt like someone who'd been lost for a very long time, and she knew something about that. She hurried to check the roast, which was perfect, the meat falling tender from the bone and the vegetables soft and savory. She pulled out her good plates, the ones with the tiny blue flowers that had belonged to her mother, and set the table with care. Fresh bread she'd baked that morning, butter she'd traded eggs for, a jar of preserves made from the wild plums that grew along the creek. She poured water into the pitcher and stood back to survey her work. The cowboy came in a few minutes later, and Sarah had to bite back a surprised sound. With the dust washed off, he was younger than she'd thought, maybe only 26 or 27. His face was lean and sun-weathered, but there was something almost beautiful about the strong line of his jaw and the shape of his mouth. He'd slicked his dark hair back with water, and drops of it still clung to his neck where his collar stood open. "Sit down, please," Sarah said, suddenly shy. "Everything's ready." He lowered himself into the chair carefully, like he was afraid he might break it, and watched as she served him. She gave him generous portions, piling his plate high with pot roast and vegetables and 2 large biscuits. When she set it in front of him, his eyes widened. "This is too much," he said, but his voice was rough with something that might have been hunger or longing or both. "Eat what you can," Sarah said simply, and served herself a smaller portion before sitting across from him. For a moment, he just stared at the food, and Sarah wondered if she should say grace or wait for him to start, or what the proper etiquette was for feeding strange cowboys in your home. But then he picked up his fork, and the decision was made for both of them. The first bite seemed to undo something in him. Sarah watched his eyes close briefly, watched his throat work as he swallowed, and when he opened his eyes again, there was something raw and vulnerable in them that made her heart squeeze tight in her chest. He took another bite, then another, and then he was eating like a man who hadn't seen a real meal in weeks, maybe months. Not frantically, but with steady, focused determination, like the food might disappear if he didn't commit it to memory. Sarah ate her own meal slowly, sneaking glances at him between bites. She'd always loved cooking, loved the way a good meal could comfort and sustain, but she'd never seen anyone respond to her food quite like this. It made something warm bloom in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. He cleaned his plate completely, sopping up the gravy with the last of his biscuit, and when he finally set down his fork, he looked almost embarrassed. "I apologize," he said. "I've been on the trail for a while, living on hardtack and jerky. I forgot what real food tasted like." "You don't need to apologize," Sarah said softly. "That's the nicest compliment a cook can get, watching someone enjoy what she made." He met her eyes across the table, and for the first time he gave her something that was almost a smile. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less guarded. "It was the best meal I've had in years," he said. "Maybe ever." "I doubt that," Sarah said, though she was pleased. "But I'm glad you liked it." "Liked it," he repeated, as if the word was entirely insufficient. He shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, you could make a fortune with cooking like that, I mean it." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Well, I do all right. I bake pies and bread to sell at the general store a few times a week. It helps with the expenses." "You live here alone?" The question came out before he could stop it, and he looked like he regretted it immediately. "Sorry, that's not my business." "It's all right," Sarah said. "Yes, I'm alone. My parents died 2 years ago. and I came west because there was nothing left for me in Missouri. I've been making my way ever since." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recognition. "I know something about that," he said quietly. "Being alone, I mean. Starting over." They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon light slanting through the window and turning the dust motes into tiny stars. Then Sarah stood and began clearing the plates. "I made apple pie yesterday," she said. "If you have room." The cowboy let out a long breath. "I shouldn't. I've already taken too much of your food and your time." "One piece of pie," Sarah said firmly. "And then you can tell me your name, because I can't keep thinking of you as that cowboy in my head." That almost smile flickered across his face again. "It's Nathaniel," he said. "Nathaniel Cross. Most people call me Nate." "Sarah McKenna," she replied, offering her hand across the table. His hand enveloped hers, work-roughened and warm, and the touch sent an unexpected shiver up her arm. She pulled away quickly and busied herself with cutting the pie. The pie was good, if she said so herself. The apples were tender and sweet-tart, the crust flaky and golden. She'd sprinkled cinnamon and just a touch of nutmeg into the filling, and when she set the slice in front of Nate, the smell alone made his eyes drift closed for a second. He ate this more slowly, savoring each bite, and Sarah found herself watching him again. There was something about the way he ate, with such complete focus and appreciation, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. Back in Missouri, her mother had taught her to cook, and they'd spent hours together in the kitchen, her mother's patient hands guiding hers. After they died, Sarah had kept cooking because it was the one thing that made her feel close to them, the one thing that made her feel capable and useful. But it had been a long time since anyone had eaten her food with such obvious pleasure. "You cook with love," Nate said suddenly, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "You can taste it in every bite. My mother used to say that you could always tell when food was made with love." Sarah felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I think she was right," she managed. "Food tastes different when you care about it, when you care about who's going to eat it." "You didn't even know me," Nate pointed out, but his voice was gentle. "No," Sarah agreed. "But you saved my life, and you looked hungry. That was enough." He finished the pie in silence, and when he was done, he sat back in his chair with a look of such complete satisfaction that Sarah had to smile. "I wish I could pay you," he said, "for the meal, but I'm pretty near broke right now." "I didn't invite you for payment," Sarah said. "I invited you because I wanted to thank you." "Still," Nate said, and there was something stubborn in his jaw now. "I don't like taking charity. If there's work you need done around the place, I could help. I'm good with my hands and I can fix most things." Sarah considered this. There were actually quite a few things that needed fixing. The chicken coop door hung crooked on its hinges, the pump out back stuck sometimes, and one of the shutters was coming loose from the wall. She'd been meaning to hire someone, but good handymen were expensive and often unreliable. "The chicken coop needs some work," she admitted, "and a few other things, but I don't want to take advantage." "You'd be doing me a favor," Nate said. "I need work anyway. I've been riding for too long, and my horse needs rest. If you've got odd jobs, I could do them in exchange for meals, just until I can move on." There was something in the way he said, "move on," that made Sarah's chest tighten, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was practical, a business arrangement. She needed help, and he needed work. It made sense. "All right," she said. "You can start tomorrow if you want. Do you have a place to stay?" "I'll camp by the creek," Nate said. "I've got my bedroll." Sarah frowned. "It gets cold at night. I have a lean-to out back, where I keep tools and firewood. You could sleep there. It's got a roof at least." He looked like he might argue, but then he just nodded. "That would be kind of you." They worked out the details as Sarah washed the dishes and Nate dried them, falling into an easy rhythm that felt strangely natural. He would do repairs and maintenance in exchange for meals, and he could sleep in the lean-to for now. When he'd saved up enough money from odd jobs around town, he'd move on. It was simple and straightforward, and Sarah tried not to think about why the idea of him moving on made her feel oddly hollow. That night, after Nate had settled his horse in a makeshift corral and bedded down in the lean-to, Sarah lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes called in the distance, and the creek burbled softly over rocks. She thought about the way Nate had eaten her food, like every bite was a revelation. She thought about his eyes, amber and guarded, and the way they'd softened when he smiled. She thought about his hands, strong and capable, and the way they'd felt wrapped around hers. This was dangerous, she knew. Getting attached to a drifter who would be gone as soon as he had money in his pocket. But it had been so long since she'd had anyone to cook for, anyone to care for. And there was something about Nathaniel Cross that called to something deep in her chest, something lonely and hopeful that she'd tried very hard to ignore. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she'd feed him breakfast and put him to work and keep things professional and distant. She wouldn't let herself wonder about the sadness in his eyes, or the way his voice roughened when he talked about his mother. She wouldn't let herself care. But even as she thought it, she knew it was already too late. Sarah woke before dawn, as she always did, and started the fire in her stove by feel in the darkness. She'd been doing this for 2 years now, and her hands knew the routine without needing light. Kindling first, then larger pieces of wood, nursing the flames until they caught and held. By the time the sky began to lighten outside her window, she had coffee brewing and was mixing batter for flapjacks. She heard Nate moving around outside, the sound of the pump working and water splashing. When he appeared at her door, his hair was damp and his face freshly shaved, and Sarah felt her heart do a small, traitorous flip in her chest. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Something smells good." "Flapjacks," Sarah said, keeping her tone brisk and practical. "And bacon. Sit down." She served him a tall stack with butter and syrup, plus 4 strips of crispy bacon and a cup of strong coffee. He ate with the same focused intensity he'd shown the night before, and Sarah had to force herself to look away, to concentrate on her own breakfast instead of watching him. "What do you want me to start with?" Nate asked when he'd finished, pushing his plate away with obvious reluctance. "The chicken coop?" "That would be good," Sarah said. "The door's hanging wrong, and I think some of the boards need replacing. There's lumber stacked by the lean-to, and tools in the box." He nodded and stood, then paused. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For breakfast, for all of this." "You're going to work for it," Sarah reminded him, but her voice was softer than she'd intended. She watched from the window as he examined the chicken coop, his movements methodical and sure. He started by taking the door completely off its hinges, laying it flat to inspect the damage. Sarah forced herself to turn away and focus on her own work. She had bread to bake for the general store and pies to make. Monday was delivery day, and Mr. Henderson expected her goods fresh and early. The day fell into a rhythm. Sarah worked in her kitchen, kneading dough and rolling out crusts, while outside, Nate hammered and sawed. Every so often she'd glance out the window and see him working, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, sweat dampening his collar despite the morning cool. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, the easy competence of his movements, the way he seemed to lose himself in the task. Around noon, Sarah brought out a lunch of cold chicken and bread with fresh butter. They ate together in the shade of the house, not talking much, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Nate told her a little about where he'd been, drifting from ranch to ranch looking for work, never staying long in any one place. Sarah told him about her parents, about how her father had been a school teacher and her mother had taken in sewing, and how fever had swept through their town one terrible winter and taken them both within days of each other. "That must have been hard," Nate said, his eyes full of understanding. "Losing them both like that?" "It was," Sarah admitted, "but staying there was harder. Everything reminded me of them, and I had no way to make a living. My father's brother offered to take me in, but he made it clear he expected me to marry his business partner, a man 3 times my age who looked at me like I was livestock." She shuddered at the memory. "So I sold what I could and bought a train ticket west." "That took courage," Nate said. "It took desperation," Sarah corrected, but she smiled a little. "Though maybe they were the same thing sometimes." After lunch, Nate went back to work and Sarah returned to her baking. By late afternoon, the chicken coop was not only fixed but reinforced, with new boards replacing the rotted ones and the door hanging straight and true. Nate had even built a small ramp leading up to it, making it easier for the hens to get in and out. "It's wonderful," Sarah said, inspecting his work. "You're very skilled." "My father was a carpenter," Nate said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Before he died. I learned from him." There was a story there, Sarah could tell, something painful in the tightness around his eyes. But she didn't push. Instead, she said, "I'm making stew for dinner, beef and vegetables. It'll be ready in about an hour." "I'll clean up," Nate said, and headed for the pump. That night's dinner was as good as the previous night's, maybe better. Sarah had made dumplings to go with the stew, light and fluffy, and fresh bread that was still warm from the oven. Nate ate 3 bowls, and when he finally stopped, it was clearly from fullness rather than lack of desire. "I'm going to get fat eating like this," he said, but he was smiling. "You could use some fattening up," Sarah replied before she could stop herself, then felt her cheeks heat. "I mean, you're too thin. You've been living on trail rations too long." "Yes, ma'am," Nate said, and there was something warm in his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. They fell into a pattern over the next few days. Nate would work on various projects around Sarah's property, fixing things she'd learned to live with broken. He repaired the pump, rehung the loose shutter, built new steps for the back door, and even started reinforcing the fence around her garden to keep out rabbits and other critters. In exchange, Sarah fed him 3 meals a day, each one prepared with the same care and attention she'd always brought to her cooking. But something was changing. Sarah found herself thinking about what Nate might like when she planned her meals. She made fried chicken because she'd noticed how much he'd enjoyed it cold for lunch. She baked apple pie again because she'd seen the way his face lit up at the first bite. She made biscuits and gravy for breakfast because he'd mentioned once, casually, that his mother used to make them on Sundays. And Nate, for his part, seemed to unfold a little more with each passing day. He talked more, sharing stories about his travels and the people he'd met. He'd been to California and back, up to Wyoming and down to Texas. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a trail driver, even a deputy for a few months in a town so small it didn't have a name. But he'd never stayed anywhere long, always moving on when things got too comfortable or too complicated. "Why?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on her small porch watching the sun set over the desert. "Why do you keep moving?" Nate was quiet for a long time, his eyes on the horizon where the sky was turning purple and gold. "I guess I never found a reason to stay," he said finally. "After my parents died, I just started drifting. Seemed easier than putting down roots somewhere and risking losing it all again." Sarah understood that, probably better than he knew. "But don't you get tired?" she asked softly. "Always moving, never having a place to call home?" "Yes," Nate admitted, and there was such weariness in that single word that Sarah's heart ached. Every day. She wanted to reach out and take his hand, to tell him he could stay here, that he didn't have to keep running. But she held herself back. It was too soon, too much. He'd been here less than a week, and for all she knew, he had reasons for leaving that had nothing to do with her. On Sunday, Sarah didn't have deliveries to make, so she decided to make a special dinner. She'd been saving a ham, and she prepared it with a glaze of brown sugar and mustard, surrounding it with sweet potatoes and green beans from her garden. She made 3 different kinds of bread and a cherry pie that she'd been planning for days, using preserves she'd put up last summer. When Nate came in for dinner and saw the spread on the table, he stopped dead in his tracks. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice awed. "Sunday dinner?" Sarah said, suddenly nervous. "I thought, since you've been working so hard, you deserved something special." He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the food, and Sarah saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. When he finally looked at her, there was something fierce and vulnerable in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "You don't have to do this." "I know," she said quietly. "I wanted to." They ate slowly that night, savoring each bite. Sarah had poured them each a small glass of wine she'd been saving, and the meal felt almost celebratory. Nate told her about his childhood, about his father's carpentry shop and his mother's garden, and Sarah told him about learning to cook at her mother's side, about the way they'd talk and laugh while they worked. After dinner, they sat on the porch again, and this time, when Sarah's hand rested on the step between them, Nate reached over and covered it with his own. His palm was warm and calloused, and Sarah felt the touch all the way down to her toes. "I should probably move on soon," Nate said, but his hand didn't move from hers. "I've about fixed everything that needs fixing around here." "There's always more work," Sarah said, her heart hammering. "The roof probably needs checking before winter, and the corral could be bigger if you wanted to stay longer." "Sarah?" His voice was rough. "You know I can't stay forever?" "I'm not asking for forever," Sarah said, though it was a lie. "Just a while longer." He turned to look at her, and in the twilight his eyes were dark and intense. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you want me to stay?" "Because I'm falling in love with you," Sarah thought, but she couldn't say it. Instead, she said, "Because you're a good worker, and because I like the company." "Is that all?" Nate asked, and his thumb was tracing small circles on the back of her hand now, sending shivers up her arm. "No," Sarah whispered. "That's not all." He leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, but Sarah didn't move. When his lips touched hers, soft and questioning, she felt something in her chest crack wide open. She kissed him back, tentative at first, and then with more confidence, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Nate rested his forehead against hers. "I'm no good for you," he said. "I'm a drifter with nothing to my name but a horse and a worn-out saddle." "I don't care," Sarah said, and she meant it. "You should," Nate said, but he kissed her again anyway, deeper this time, his hand sliding into her hair. They sat there on the porch until the stars came out, kissing and talking in low voices, and Sarah felt like something fundamental had shifted in her world. She'd been alone for so long, working so hard just to survive, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond basic survival. But she wanted this. She wanted Nate, wanted his smile and his hands and the way he looked at her like she was something precious. That night, Nate went back to the lean-to, as usual, but the next morning, when Sarah woke and looked out her window, she saw that he'd already been up for hours. He was working on the roof, just as she'd suggested, checking for loose shingles and weak spots. The sight of him up there, silhouetted against the early morning sky, made her heart swell. She made him a huge breakfast, eggs and bacon and biscuits with gravy, because she knew he'd need the fuel for the hard work ahead. When he came in, they didn't talk much, but every time their eyes met, there was a new awareness between them, a promise of something neither of them had quite named yet. The days that followed were some of the happiest Sarah could remember. She and Nate fell into an easy domestic rhythm, working side by side during the day and spending the evenings together on the porch or at the kitchen table. Sarah taught him to make bread, laughing at his clumsy attempts to knead the dough, and Nate showed her how to carve wood, guiding her hands with his as they shaped a spoon from a piece of cedar. They kissed often now, stolen moments throughout the day. A quick press of lips when Nate came in for lunch. A longer, deeper kiss in the evening after dinner. Sarah had never felt this way before, this combination of comfort and excitement, contentment and hunger. She wanted more, wanted everything, but she also didn't want to rush. This thing between them felt fragile and precious, and she was afraid of breaking it. 2 weeks after that first night, Nate finished the last of the repairs Sarah could think of. The property was in better shape than it had ever been, every board tight and every hinge oiled. They both knew what that meant, though neither of them said it out loud. That night, Sarah made Nate's favorite meal, the pot roast and biscuits from that first dinner. She set the table with extra care, lighting candles even though it wasn't a special occasion. Or maybe it was the most important meal she'd ever cook. Nate ate slowly, his eyes on her more than on his plate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and serious. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I've been drifting." Sarah set down her fork, her heart suddenly racing. "All right." 5 years ago, Nate said, "I had a ranch. Nothing big, just a small spread up in Colorado. I had a partner, a man I thought was my friend. We were going to build it up together, make something of it." He paused, his jaw tight. "He ran off with all our money and the deed to the property. Left me with nothing but debts I couldn't pay. I lost everything." "Oh, Nate," Sarah said softly. "I've been running ever since," he continued. "Afraid to trust anyone, afraid to put down roots. Figured if I never stayed anywhere, I could never lose anything again." He looked up at her, and his eyes were full of pain and hope. "But then, I met you, and you fed me like I was worth feeding. You looked at me like I was worth something, and I realized I've been starving for a lot more than just food." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "You are worth something," she said fiercely. "You're worth everything." "I don't have anything to offer you," Nate said. "No money, no property, no prospects. But I'm asking anyway, because I can't help myself. Sarah, I want to stay, not just for a few more weeks, but for good, if you'll have me." Sarah was around the table before she'd even made a conscious decision to move, throwing herself into his arms. He caught her, standing and lifting her off her feet, and she kissed him with everything she had, trying to pour 2 years of loneliness and hope and need into that single kiss. "Yes," she said when they finally broke apart. "Yes, stay." Please stay." Nate kissed her again, and this time it was different, deeper and more desperate. Sarah clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, and when he groaned against her mouth, she felt heat pool low in her belly. They stumbled together toward her bedroom, shedding clothes between kisses, and when Nate laid her down on her narrow bed, she felt like her heart might burst from the fullness of it. He was gentle with her, careful and reverent, even though Sarah could feel the tension thrumming through his body. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she explored the planes of his chest and the strength of his shoulders, but Nate kissed her until the nervousness melted into want. When he finally joined their bodies, Sarah gasped at the intensity of it, at the feeling of being connected to someone so completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in her small bed, Nate's arm around her waist and Sarah's head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she traced lazy patterns on his skin with her fingertips. "I love you," Nate said into the darkness. "I know it's too soon, but I do. I think I started falling in love with you the first time you smiled at me." "I love you too," Sarah whispered back. "I've been trying not to, but I can't help it." "Don't fight it," Nate said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I'm not going anywhere." They made plans that night, lying in each other's arms. Nate would find work in town, maybe at the livery or one of the ranches nearby. Sarah would keep baking and selling her goods. Together, they'd make enough to keep the house and maybe even expand it someday. They'd plant a bigger garden in the spring, maybe get a milk cow. They'd build a life, slowly and carefully, piece by piece. The next morning, Nate moved his things from the lean-to into the house. It wasn't much, just a bedroll and saddlebags and his horse's tack. But the sight of his belongings mixed with hers made Sarah's heart swell. This was real. He was staying. Over the next few weeks, Nate found steady work at the livery in town. The owner, a gruff man named Pete, needed help with the horses and the smithing work, and he was impressed with Nate's skills. The pay wasn't much, but it was regular, and combined with Sarah's baking income, they had enough to live comfortably. They settled into their new life together with surprising ease. Nate would leave early in the morning and return in the evening, tired and dusty, but smiling when he saw Sarah waiting for him. She always had dinner ready, something hot and filling, and they'd eat together while Nate told her about his day, and Sarah shared the town gossip she'd picked up at the general store. People in Tombstone talked, of course. A single woman living with a man she wasn't married to was scandalous, even in a rough town like this. But Sarah had learned not to care too much what people thought, and Nate seemed completely unconcerned with public opinion. They were happy, and that was all that mattered. Still, after about a month, Nate brought up the subject one evening after dinner. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I've been thinking about us, about what people are saying." Sarah tensed. "If you're worried about my reputation, I'm not." "It's not that," Nate said quickly. "I don't give a damn what people say, but I've been thinking that maybe we should make it official. Get married, I mean, if you want to." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," Nate said, and then he slid off his chair and onto one knee right there in her kitchen. "Sarah McKenna, will you marry me? I know I'm not much of a catch, and I can't give you fancy things or a big house, but I can promise to love you every day for the rest of my life. I can promise to work hard and come home to you every night. And I can promise to never, ever take for granted the way you cook with love, or the way you make everything feel like home." Sarah was crying now, happy tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, pulling him up and into her arms. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, which she'd altered to fit, and Nate wore a new suit that he'd bought with his first month's wages. They didn't have many guests, just a few acquaintances from town and Pete from the livery, but Sarah didn't care. All that mattered was the way Nate looked at her when she walked down the aisle, like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The minister pronounced them man and wife, and when Nate kissed her, Sarah felt like her heart might actually burst from happiness. This man, this wonderful, broken, beautiful man, who ate her food like it was the finest feast in the world, who looked at her like she hung the moon, who'd promised to love her forever. He was hers now, and she was his, and nothing had ever felt more right. They had a small celebration at the house afterward. Sarah had spent days preparing food, a massive spread of all Nate's favorites. There was fried chicken and pot roast, biscuits and cornbread, 3 different kinds of pie, and a cake sheet decorated with wildflowers. They invited a few more people this time, neighbors and friends from town, and everyone ate and drank and celebrated late into the evening. When the last guest had finally left, Nate swept Sarah up into his arms and carried her over the threshold of her bedroom, their bedroom now. "Hello, Mrs. Cross," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Hello, Mr. Cross," Sarah replied, and kissed him until they were both breathless. Their wedding night was even better than their first time, without the nervousness and uncertainty. They knew each other's bodies now, knew what made the other gasp and moan, and they took their time exploring and savoring. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the sheets, Sarah felt a peace she'd never known before. She was home, finally, and completely home, and so was Nate. The months that followed were busy and happy. Winter came to Arizona, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain. Sarah and Nate worked together to prepare the house for the cold, banking the walls with earth and making sure they had plenty of firewood. Nate built Sarah a new stove for Christmas, bigger and better than her old one. And Sarah made him a quilt from scraps of fabric she'd been collecting, each piece carefully chosen and stitched with love. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, Nate carving or amending tack, while Sarah knitted or sewed. Sometimes they'd read aloud to each other from the few books they had. Sometimes they'd just talk, sharing stories about their pasts and dreams for their future. And always, there were Sarah's meals, prepared with the same care and love she'd shown from the very beginning. Nate never took them for granted, always thanking her and complimenting her cooking, always eating like every meal might be his last. "You're going to spoil me," he said one night after a particularly excellent dinner of roasted pork with apples and sage. "That's the plan," Sarah replied with a smile. "I want you fat and happy and too comfortable to ever think about leaving." "I'd never leave," Nate said seriously, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Not for anything in the world. You're my home now, Sarah. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Sarah discovered she was pregnant in March, and the news sent Nate into a panic of excitement and worry. He became almost absurdly protective, not wanting her to lift anything heavy or work too hard. Sarah found it both touching and exasperating, but she couldn't deny that she loved seeing him so excited about their baby. "I hope he has your eyes," Nate said one night, his hand resting on Sarah's still flat stomach. "What if it's a girl?" Sarah asked. "Then I hope she has your spirit," Nate said, "and your talent for cooking, and your kind heart." The pregnancy was relatively easy, though Sarah got tired more quickly than usual. Nate took over more of the household chores, insisting that Sarah rest. He'd come home from the livery and cook dinner, following Sarah's instructions, but adding his own clumsy touches. The meals were never quite as good as Sarah's, but they were made with love, and that made them delicious in their own way. In October, on a cool autumn evening, Sarah went into labor. Nate rode like the devil was chasing him to fetch the midwife, and then paced the kitchen like a caged animal while Sarah labored in the bedroom. It took all night and into the next morning, but finally, just as the sun was rising, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When the midwife placed the baby in Nate's arms for the first time, Sarah watched his face transform. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he looked at his son, at the tiny, perfect features and the small fists waving in the air. "He's beautiful," Nate whispered. "Sarah, he's perfect." They named him Thomas, after Nate's father, and from the moment he was born, he was the center of their world. Nate was an attentive father, getting up for nighttime feedings and changing diapers without complaint. He'd rock Thomas for hours, singing old cowboy ballads in his rough voice, and Sarah would watch them together and feel her heart swell with love. Life settled into a new rhythm with the baby. Sarah still cooked, though she had less time for the elaborate meals she used to make. But Nate didn't care. He ate whatever she put in front of him with the same appreciation, whether it was a simple stew or a complex roast. "It's not about the food," he told her one night when she apologized for the plain fare. "It's about the love you put into it. I can taste that in a bowl of beans just as much as in a fancy dinner." Thomas grew quickly, a happy, healthy baby with Nate's dark hair and Sarah's blue eyes. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the house, getting into everything and making them both laugh with his antics. They had a small party for him, just a few friends from town, and Sarah made a special cake that Thomas promptly demolished with his chubby hands. "We did good," Nate said that night, watching Sarah nurse Thomas before bed. Look at what we made. We did, Sarah agreed. I never thought I could be this happy, Nate. After my parents died, I thought that part of my life was over, but you gave it back to me. You gave me a family again. You saved me, Nate said quietly. I was lost before I met you, starving in more ways than one. You fed me, body and soul, and you gave me a reason to stop running. I love you, Sarah, more than I can ever say. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Nate got promoted at the livery, taking over more of the business as Pete got older. Sarah's baking business grew too, with people coming from all over Tombstone to buy her pies and bread. They saved their money carefully, adding a new room onto the house when Thomas was 3 and Sarah was pregnant with their second child. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1885, a tiny, beautiful thing with blonde hair and Nate's amber eyes. They named her Elizabeth, after Sarah's mother, and if possible, Nate fell even more in love with his little family. He'd come home from work and scoop up both children, spinning them around until they shrieked with laughter, and then he'd kiss Sarah like she was the most precious thing in the world. "How did I get so lucky?" he'd say, and Sarah would smile and pull him down for another kiss. They had one more child, another boy they named Daniel, when Thomas was 6 and Elizabeth was 3. Their little house was bursting at the seams now, full of laughter and noise and love. Sarah's days were busy with cooking and cleaning and childcare, but she'd never been happier. This was what she'd dreamed of during those lonely nights in Missouri before she'd come west. A home, a family, someone to love and care for. The children grew up surrounded by love and good food. Sarah taught all of them to cook, and they'd spend hours in the kitchen together, making bread and pies and roasts. Thomas showed a real talent for it, and by the time he was 10, he could make biscuits almost as good as his mother's. Elizabeth preferred baking, creating elaborate cakes and cookies that were as beautiful as they were delicious. Even little Daniel, still so young, loved to help, standing on a stool to stir batter or knead dough. Nate taught them other things too. He taught Thomas to ride and to care for horses. He taught Elizabeth how to carve wood, guiding her small hands with his larger ones. He taught all of them about hard work and honesty and treating people with respect. And he showed them, every single day, how much he loved their mother. "Your pa still looks at me like I'm the most beautiful woman in the world," Sarah told Elizabeth one day when she was helping her mother with the bread. "Even though I'm older now, and I've got gray in my hair." "That's because you are the most beautiful woman in the world," Elizabeth said seriously. And Sarah laughed and hugged her daughter close. When Pete died, he left the livery to Nate in his will. It was a shock, but Pete had no family of his own. And he'd told Nate once that he thought of him as the son he'd never had. Suddenly, Nate owned his own business, and their financial situation improved dramatically. They were able to pay off the last of their debts and start saving for the children's futures. "We should celebrate," Nate said the night they got the news. "What do you want to do?" "I want to cook you dinner," Sarah said with a smile. "The dinner, the one I made you that first night." So Sarah made pot roast and vegetables and biscuits, the same meal she'd served Nate all those years ago when he was a starving drifter who'd saved her life. She set the table with care, lighting candles and putting out her mother's good plates. The children were sleeping, and it was just the two of them, like in the early days. Nate ate slowly, savoring each bite, and when he looked at her across the table, his eyes were full of love and memory. "You still cook with love," he said softly, "and it still shows in every bite. And you still eat like you're starving," Sarah replied with a smile. "I am starving," Nate said. "For you, for this life we've built. I'll never get enough of it, Sarah, never." They made love that night like they were young again, passionate and tender and full of promise. And afterward, lying in each other's arms, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that terrifying moment when a bullet had grazed her cheek to the quiet domestic happiness of their life now. She'd lost so much, her parents and her home and her sense of safety. But she'd gained so much more. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a tall, serious young man who decided to become a teacher like his grandfather had been. Elizabeth became known throughout Tombstone for her beautiful baked goods, and people started asking her to make cakes for weddings and special occasions. Daniel showed an interest in horses like his father, spending hours at the livery learning the business. Sarah and Nate grew older together, their bodies softening and slowing, but their love never dimming. Nate's hair went completely gray, and Sarah got wrinkles around her eyes from a lifetime of smiling. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been, scared and alone and desperate for connection. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. They were in their 50s now, grandparents to Thomas's twin boys. "Staying here with me instead of moving on?" Nate turned to look at her, his amber eyes as intense as they had been the day they met. "Never," he said firmly. "Not once. You gave me everything, Sarah. A home, a family, a purpose. You taught me that I was worth more than I thought, that I deserved to be loved and fed and cared for." "You taught me the same thing," Sarah said softly. "I was so alone before you came, just going through the motions of living, but you made me want to really live again." "We saved each other," Nate said, taking her hand, "and we built something beautiful together." They sat there until the stars came out, holding hands and remembering. Sarah thought about all the meals she'd cooked over the years, all the times she'd watched Nate eat her food with such appreciation and joy. It had never been just about the cooking, she realized. It had been about love, about care, about showing someone that they mattered, and Nate, with his hunger and his gratitude, had shown her that she mattered too. Thomas eventually moved away to take a teaching position in Phoenix, but he visited often with his growing family. Elizabeth married a rancher and settled just outside of town, close enough that she could visit almost daily. Daniel took over the livery completely when Nate finally retired, running it with the same care and attention his father had shown. Sarah kept cooking, though she moved a bit slower now. She still made Sunday dinners for the whole family, big noisy affairs with children running around and laughter filling the house. And Nate still ate her food like it was the finest feast in the world, still thanked her for every meal, still looked at her like she was a miracle. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a party. It seemed like the whole town turned out, people Sarah had fed over the years and people whose horses Nate had shod. There were speeches and toasts, and someone had made a banner that said, 30 years of love. But the best moment came at the end of the night, when everyone had gone home, and it was just Sarah and Nate in their kitchen. Sarah had saved them each a piece of the anniversary cake, and they sat at their old table, the same one where they'd eaten that first meal together so long ago. "I have something to tell you," Nate said, and Sarah looked up in surprise at the serious tone of his voice. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about that day we met," Nate said. "When those men were shooting and I pulled you into that alley. I've thought about it a lot over the years." "Me too," Sarah said. "I used to think it was luck," Nate continued, "or fate, or whatever you want to call it. But now I think it was something else. I think it was meant to be. You were meant to invite me to dinner that day, and I was meant to say yes. We were meant to find each other, Sarah, meant to build this life together." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. "I think you're right," she whispered. "I want to thank you," Nate said, his voice rough with emotion. "For every meal you've ever cooked me, for every time you welcomed me home, for every moment of love and care you've given me over the past 30 years. You took a starving man and you fed him, body and soul. You gave him a reason to live. I can never repay you for that." "You don't have to repay me," Sarah said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You've given me just as much. You gave me a home and a family and a love I never thought I'd have. We're even, Nate. We've always been even." They sat there for a long time, holding hands across the table, surrounded by the evidence of their life together. The house full of memories, the children and grandchildren they had raised, the love that had sustained them through hard times and good. Sarah thought about that first meal, the way Nate had eaten like he'd been starving forever. And she realized that, in a way, they'd both been starving. Starving for connection, for love, for someone to see them and value them and choose them. They'd found that in each other, and it had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. The years continued to flow by, like water in the creek behind their house, steady and constant. Sarah and Nate settled into their golden years with grace, their lives now revolving around their children and grandchildren. The house that had once seemed so small was expanded again, with Nate and Daniel building an additional wing where extended family could stay when they visited. Sarah's hair turned completely white, soft and fine as cotton, and she moved with more deliberation now, her hands sometimes aching from decades of kneading dough and chopping vegetables. But she still cooked, still poured love into every meal. She just had more help now, with Elizabeth and her daughters, and even some of the granddaughters learning the recipes that had been passed down through generations. "You need to write these down, Mama," Elizabeth insisted one afternoon as they worked together on a massive batch of pies for a church social. "What if we forget? What if the grandchildren don't remember exactly how you made these?" So Sarah began the painstaking process of recording her recipes, measuring and writing, and trying to capture not just the ingredients, but the feel of things, the way dough should look when it was properly kneaded, the sound a pie made when it was ready to come out of the oven. It was harder than she expected, putting into words what had always been instinct and experience. Nate helped, his spectacles perched on his nose as he wrote down her instructions in his careful hand. 3 cups of flour, or thereabouts, he'd read back to her, and Sarah would laugh and try to be more precise. But they both knew that cooking was as much about love and intuition as it was about measurements. When Thomas's boys were old enough, they started spending summers at the ranch that Elizabeth's husband had built up into something quite prosperous. Nate would take them out riding, teaching them about horses and cattle and the land. They'd come back dusty and exhausted, and Sarah would have dinner waiting, huge platters of food that the growing boys would devour. "You eat just like your grandfather," Sarah told the older twin, watching him take his 3rd helping of fried chicken. "Like you've never seen food before." "That's because it's so good, Grandma," the boy said with a grin that reminded her so much of young Nate that her heart squeezed. Daniel married when he was 26, a pretty girl from town named Rebecca, who was shy but kind. They had their wedding at Sarah and Nate's house, with Sarah orchestrating a feast that people talked about for years afterward. She made everything she could think of, determined that her youngest child's wedding would be remembered. And when she saw Daniel dancing with his new bride, saw the way he looked at her with such love and hope, she squeezed Nate's hand and felt tears of happiness slip down her cheeks. "We did that," Nate whispered in her ear. "We showed them what love looks like." "We did," Sarah agreed. More grandchildren came, a whole passel of them eventually, and Sarah's house was rarely quiet. There were always children underfoot, always someone needing a scraped knee tended, or a story told, or a cookie snuck before dinner. Nate loved it, holding court in his favorite chair, while grandchildren climbed on him and begged for stories about the old days. "Tell us about how you met Grandma," they'd plead, and Nate would settle in to tell the story once again. About the shootout in the street, about dragging a pretty young woman to safety, about the dinner invitation that changed his life. The story grew a bit more elaborate with each telling, but the heart of it remained the same. He'd been lost and starving, and Sarah had fed him and loved him back to life. When Nate turned 65, he finally sold the livery to Daniel outright, though he still went by most days to help out and give advice. He spent more time at home now, and he and Sarah fell into new routines. They'd work in the garden together, Sarah giving instructions while Nate did the heavy digging. They'd sit on the porch in the evening, watching the desert turn purple and gold with sunset. And they'd cook together, something they'd done occasionally over the years, but now had time to really enjoy. "You're getting pretty good at this," Sarah said one evening, watching Nate expertly flip a fried egg. "I learned from the best," Nate replied, and leaned over to kiss her cheek. They celebrated their 40th anniversary with another big party, this one even larger than the last. It seemed impossible that they had been together for 4 decades, but the evidence was all around them. Children and grandchildren, a thriving business, a home filled with love and memories. People came from all over to celebrate with them, some traveling for days to be there. "You two are an inspiration," the minister said in his toast. "In a time and place where life is hard and uncertain, you've built something beautiful and lasting. You've shown us all what commitment and love really mean." That night, lying in bed, Sarah turned to Nate. "Do you feel old?" she asked. "Every day," Nate said with a laugh. "My back hurts, my knees creak, and I can't see worth a damn without spectacles. But when I look at you, I still feel like that young fool who fell in love over a plate of pot roast." "We're not so young anymore," Sarah said softly. "No," Nate agreed, "but we're still in love. That's what matters." The next few years brought changes. Pete's old building, the one that housed the livery, was bought by a developer who wanted to tear it down and build something modern. Daniel fought it, but eventually he had to accept that Tombstone was changing, becoming less of a wild frontier town and more of a settled place. He built a new livery on the outskirts of town, bigger and better equipped, and business actually improved. Thomas became the headmaster of his school in Phoenix, a position of respect and authority. Elizabeth's husband died suddenly of a heart attack, and she moved back closer to town with her younger children, the older ones having married and started families of their own. Sarah and Nate helped however they could, and Sarah made sure Elizabeth and her children had dinner at their house at least 3 times a week. "You don't have to take care of us, Mama," Elizabeth said one evening, though she looked grateful and exhausted. "Of course I do," Sarah said firmly. "That's what family does. We take care of each other." Nate's health began to decline when he was in his early 70s. Nothing dramatic, just a slow wearing down. He got winded more easily, tired more quickly. The doctor said it was his heart, working too hard after a lifetime of physical labor. There was nothing to be done except rest and take things easy, which Nate found almost impossible to do. "I can't just sit around," he grumbled one afternoon when Sarah caught him trying to repair the fence. "You can and you will," Sarah said firmly. "Daniel can fix the fence. You need to rest." "I've been resting my whole life," Nate protested. "Every night I came home to you, that was rest. Every meal you made me, that was rest. I'm not going to spend my last years doing nothing." "Your last years," Sarah repeated, her voice sharp with fear and anger. "Don't talk like that." Nate's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. "Sarah, love, we both know I'm not going to live forever. Nobody does. But I'm not afraid. I've had a good life. The best life. Because of you." Sarah blinked back tears. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I'm not ready to lose you." "I know," Nate said gently. "I'm not ready to go either, so I'll fight to stay as long as I can. But when my time comes, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't stop living," Nate said. "Don't stop cooking and taking care of the family and being you. Promise me." "I promise," Sarah said, though the words felt like broken glass in her throat. Nate did fight, and he managed to hold on for another 3 years. They were good years, mostly, filled with family and love. He got to meet 2 more great-grandchildren, tiny perfect beings that he held with shaking hands and tears in his eyes. He got to see Daniel expand the livery business into breeding horses, a venture that proved quite successful. He got to attend Thomas's retirement party, celebrating his son's long career in education. And every day Sarah cooked for him. She made all his favorites, rotating through the meals they'd shared over 43 years of marriage. Some days he had more appetite than others, but he always ate what she made, always thanked her, always looked at her with the same love and appreciation he'd shown from the very beginning. "You're still the best cook in the territory," he told her one evening after a simple meal of soup and bread. He hadn't been able to eat much, his appetite fading along with his strength, but he'd finished every drop in his bowl. "And you're still the best eater," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice light even though her heart was breaking. They both knew the end was coming. The doctor had been clear about that. Nate's heart was failing, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. It was just a matter of time. On a warm evening in late September, with the desert air finally cooling after a brutal summer, Nate asked Sarah to make him pot roast one more time, the same meal she'd made him that very first night, all those years ago. Sarah's hands shook as she prepared it, knowing what this meant, but she poured all her love into it anyway. Every chop of the vegetables, every turn of the meat, every knead of the biscuit dough was an act of devotion. The whole family gathered for dinner that night. All 3 children and their families, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, filling the house to bursting. They ate together, passing platters and telling stories and laughing, though there was an undercurrent of sadness in everything. They all knew why they were there. After dinner, after the family had reluctantly gone home with promises to return tomorrow, Sarah and Nate sat together on their porch. He was wrapped in a blanket despite the warm evening, and Sarah had pulled her chair right up next to his so she could hold his hand. "That was perfect," Nate said, his voice thin and tired. "Thank you, Sarah, for that meal, and for every meal you've ever made me, for every act of love and care, for choosing me all those years ago." "You saved my life," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face now. "That day in the street. And then you saved it again, every day after. You gave me a reason to cook, a reason to care, a reason to be." "We saved each other," Nate said, echoing the words he'd spoken so many times over the years. His hand tightened weakly on hers. "I love you, Sarah Cross. I've loved you since the moment you invited a dusty stranger to dinner, I'll love you until my last breath, and probably beyond that too." "I love you," Sarah whispered, "so much. I don't know how to do this without you." "You'll figure it out," Nate said with the ghost of his old smile. "You're strong, Sarah, stronger than you know. You'll cook and you'll care for the family and you'll live, for both of us." They sat there for hours, watching the stars come out, holding hands and remembering. Sarah told him about all the things she'd loved about their life together, and Nate told her the same. They remembered their first kiss, their wedding day, the births of their children. They remembered hard times and good times, fights and reconciliations, moments of joy and moments of sorrow. "No regrets?" Sarah asked as the night grew deeper. "Not a single one," Nate said. "You?" "No," Sarah said. "Only that we didn't have more time." "We had enough," Nate said. "More than enough. We had a lifetime." As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Nate took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I'm tired, love," he said. "So tired." "I know," Sarah said, though it took everything she had to keep her voice steady. "You can rest now. I've got you." "Will you sing to me?" Nate asked. "Like you used to sing to the babies?" So Sarah sang, soft and low, an old lullaby her mother had taught her. She sang about love and home and being safe, and as the sun rose over the Arizona desert, turning the sky pink and gold, Nathaniel Cross took his last breath with his wife's hand in his, and her voice in his ears. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over to pay their respects. Nate had been well loved in Tombstone, known for his honesty and his skill with horses and his devotion to his family. But mostly, people came because of the love story. Everyone knew about the cowboy and the cook, about how they'd found each other and built something beautiful. Their story had become legend in the town, a reminder that love could flourish even in harsh conditions. Sarah made it through the funeral with dignity, supported by her children and grandchildren. But afterward, when everyone had gone home and she was alone in the house for the first time in 43 years, she finally let herself fall apart. She sat in Nate's chair and wept, great racking sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. She cried for the loss of him, for the empty space he'd left behind, for all the meals she'd never cook for him again. But she'd made him a promise, and Sarah McKenna Cross had never broken a promise in her life. So after a day of grief, she got up and started living again. She cooked because that's what she did. She made breakfast for Elizabeth's daughter, who'd come to stay with her. She baked pies for the church social. She taught her granddaughters the recipes she'd written down, making sure they understood that cooking was about more than just following instructions. "It's about love," Grandma Sarah used to tell them, her hands guiding theirs as they kneaded dough. "When you cook with love, people can taste it. Your grandfather always said he could taste it in every bite I made him. That's the secret, girls. That's what makes food special." The months passed slowly. Sarah missed Nate every single day, missed his presence in the house, missed cooking for him and watching him eat. But she found comfort in the family he'd left behind, in the legacy they had built together. She spent time with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their great-grandfather. She helped Elizabeth with her bakery, which had grown into a thriving business. She visited Thomas in Phoenix and marveled at how much the city had grown. On what would have been their 44th anniversary, Sarah made pot roast again. She set the table with her mother's good plates and lit candles, and she served 2 portions, one for herself and one for the empty chair across from her where Nate had always sat. It was silly, maybe, but it made her feel close to him. She could almost see him there, smiling at her across the table, telling her how good everything was. "I miss you," she said to the empty chair, "every minute of every day, but I'm still here, like I promised. I'm still living for both of us." She thought she felt a warmth in the room then, a presence that might have been her imagination, but felt real nonetheless. And she could swear she heard Nate's voice in her mind, as clear as if he were sitting right there. "I know, love, and I'm so proud of you." Sarah lived for another 8 years after Nate died. They were good years, full of family and purpose. She got to see more great-grandchildren born, got to attend more weddings and celebrations. She taught dozens of young women to cook, passing on, not just recipes, but philosophy, the understanding that food was love made tangible. And every Sunday, she made pot roast, setting 2 places at the table and talking to Nate as if he were still there. When Sarah died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 81, the whole town mourned. They buried her next to Nate in the little cemetery on the hill, and the headstone read, Sarah McKenna Cross, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. She cooked with love, and it showed in every bite. At the funeral, Thomas stood to give the eulogy. He was an old man himself now, with white hair and grandchildren of his own. But his voice was strong as he spoke about his mother and father, about the love story that had shaped his entire life. My parents taught us what commitment looks like, he said, what devotion looks like. My father used to say that my mother saved him, that she fed him when he was starving for more than just food. And my mother always said that my father saved her right back, that he gave her a reason to care and to love. They saved each other, and in doing so, they built something that lasted longer than either of their lives. They built a family, a legacy, a love that we all carry with us. And every time we sit down to a meal, every time we take care of someone we love, we honor them. We keep their story alive. After the funeral, the whole family gathered at the house one last time. The house that Sarah and Nate had built and expanded and filled with love. Elizabeth and her daughters had spent the day cooking, making all of Sarah's recipes. Pot roast and biscuits, fried chicken and gravy, 3 different kinds of pie. The table was laden with food, and the house was full of people, 4 generations sitting down to eat together. As they passed the platters and filled their plates, Daniel stood to make a toast. To Sarah and Nate, he said, raising his glass, who taught us that the secret ingredient is always love, who showed us that even in the hardest times, in the roughest places, you can build something beautiful if you're willing to fight for it. We love you, we miss you, and we promise to keep your story alive. To Sarah and Nate, everyone echoed, and they drank. And then they ate, savoring every bite, tasting the love that had gone into every dish. The recipes might have been Sarah's, but the spirit behind them, the understanding that food was about more than just sustenance, that had come from both of them, from a starving cowboy who'd learned to appreciate every meal, and from a lonely woman who'd learned to pour her heart into her cooking. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and gold. And if you listened very carefully, you might have heard the sound of laughter carried on the evening breeze, the kind of laughter that comes from a lifetime of joy and love and contentment. You might have heard 2 voices, forever young and forever together, celebrating a love that death itself couldn't diminish. In the years that followed, Sarah's recipes were passed down through the generations. Her great-great-grandchildren made her pot roast for Sunday dinners. Her great-great-great-grandchildren baked her pies for holidays. And every time they cooked, they remembered the story of their ancestors, of the cowboy who ate like he'd been starving forever, and the woman who'd fed him with love. The little house with the blue shutters eventually became a historical landmark, preserved as an example of what life was like in old Tombstone. Tour guides told the story of Sarah and Nate to visitors, and people from all over the world came to see where the famous love story had unfolded. There was even a restaurant in town named Sarah's Kitchen, which served all of her recipes and had become famous throughout Arizona. But the real legacy wasn't in buildings or businesses. It was in the descendants who scattered across the country, carrying with them the lessons their ancestors had taught. That love was worth fighting for. That caring for others, feeding them and nurturing them, was one of the highest callings. That even when you've lost everything, you can build something new if you're brave enough to try. Thomas's grandson became a chef in San Francisco, opening a restaurant that earned national acclaim. In interviews, he always credited his great-grandmother Sarah, saying that she'd taught him that the secret to great cooking wasn't fancy techniques or expensive ingredients. It was love, pure and simple. Elizabeth's great-granddaughter wrote a cookbook based on Sarah's recipes, with stories about the family woven throughout. It became a bestseller, and people wrote letters saying that the recipes reminded them of their own grandmothers, their own family traditions, that the food tasted like home. Daniel's descendants continued to run the livery, which eventually transitioned into a modern stable and riding school. But they kept Nate's old tools on display, and they told students about the man who'd built the business from nothing, who'd proven that drifters could put down roots and build lasting legacies. 100 years after Sarah and Nate met, their great-great-great-grandchildren organized a family reunion in Tombstone. Over 200 people came, descendants from all branches of the family tree. They gathered at the old house and in the cemetery telling stories and sharing memories that had been passed down through generations. The oldest member of the family, Thomas's daughter, who was now 97 years old, stood to speak. She'd been only 12 when Sarah died, but she remembered her grandmother vividly. "I remember Grandma Sarah's hands," she said, her voice wavering but strong. "They were always busy, always working, always cooking or sewing, or tending to someone. And I remember how Grandpa Nate looked at her, even when he was old and sick, like she was the most precious thing in the world. They taught us all what real love looks like. Not the easy kind you see in movies, but the hard kind. The kind that shows up every day and does the work. The kind that cooks dinner when you're exhausted, that holds hands through the hard times, that chooses to stay when leaving would be easier." She paused, looking around at all the faces, young and old, all connected by blood and by the story of two people who'd loved each other well. "We're all here because a starving cowboy met a lonely woman, and they decided to build something together. They started with nothing but each other, and look what they made. Look at all of us. We're their legacy. We're proof that love doesn't just sustain two people. It ripples out, touching generations, creating families, building futures." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. They all felt it, the weight and beauty of their shared history. They were part of something bigger than themselves, part of a love story that had transcended time and circumstance. That night, the family shared a meal together, cooked using Sarah's recipes, pot roast and biscuits, just like that first dinner so long ago. And as they ate, passing platters and telling stories and laughing together, it felt like Sarah and Nate were there with them. Not as ghosts or memories, but as living presences woven into the very fabric of who they all were. Someone raised a toast, and someone else started singing an old song that Nate used to sing to the children. The voices rose together, harmonizing imperfectly but beautifully, and the sound carried out across the desert night. It was a celebration, a remembrance, a promise to carry forward the legacy they'd been given. The story of Sarah McKenna and Nathaniel Cross became more than just family lore. It became a reminder that love could flourish in the unlikeliest places, between the unlikeliest people, that sometimes salvation came in the form of a home-cooked meal and a kind word, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was open your door to a stranger and offer them a seat at your table. Historians wrote about them, folklorists collected their story, and artists painted scenes from their life. But the truest tribute came from the ordinary people who heard their story and decided to love a little harder, to care a little more deeply, to put a little more heart into the meals they cooked for the people they loved. Because in the end, that was what Sarah and Nate had really been about. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the quiet daily choice to show love through actions, to feed and to nurture, to see someone else's hunger, whether physical or spiritual, and to do something about it. She cooked with love, and it showed in every bite. He ate like he'd been starving forever, because in many ways, he had been. Together, they built a life, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. They proved that love wasn't just a feeling, but a practice, something you did every single day in 1,000 small ways. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Sarah and Nate were together still. She was cooking in a kitchen filled with light, and he was watching her with those amber eyes full of love and wonder. When she set the plate in front of him, he'd eat like it was the first meal he'd ever had, and she'd smile because she knew exactly what he was tasting. Not just the food, but everything it represented. Home, safety, love, belonging. They'd found each other in the chaos of a gunfight on a dusty street in Tombstone, Arizona in 1884. Two lonely souls who'd both lost so much, who'd both been adrift in different ways. And they'd chosen each other, built something beautiful together, and left behind a legacy that would touch countless lives. That was the real happily ever after. Not perfection, but presence. Not ease, but effort. Not fairy tale magic, but the everyday miracle of two people who loved each other well and truly, so who fed each other in every sense of the word, and who created something that would outlast them both. The story lived on, passed from generation to generation, inspiring countless others to open their hearts and their homes, to feed the hungry, whether their hunger was for food or for love or for belonging, to see the people around them, really see them, and to offer whatever comfort and care they could. And every time someone cooked a meal with love, every time someone offered food to a stranger, every time someone chose connection over isolation, Sarah and Nate's legacy continued. Their love story wasn't just about the past, it was about the present and the future too, about all the ways that love could transform and sustain and create. She cooked with love, and it showed in every bite. He ate like he'd been starving forever, and in feeding him, she fed herself too. They saved each other, built a life together, and left the world better than they found it. What more could anyone ask for than that? The end of their story was really just the beginning, a love that would echo through time, inspiring others to open their hearts and to believe that even in the hardest circumstances, love could find a way. And in the vast Arizona desert, under endless stars, their spirits danced together still, forever young, forever in love, forever home.